Hit it.
Welcome to the Test Talks podcast, the place to go to geek out on software testing. And now your host, whose mission is to help you succeed with test automation, Joe Colantonio.
Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to another episode of Test Talks. Today, I'm super excited to have on the show for the first time Simon Stewart, creator of Selenium WebDriver. I can't believe it's been over 200 episodes and I've never had Simon on the show, but I actually got lucky. I actually was at SauceCon this year, and Simon was speaking there. And when I met him, I actually got up the nerve to ask him if I can interview him. A lot of people, you might know this, I've said this before, I'm actually very much an introvert. And when I go to an on-site conference, I bring all my audio gear, thinking I'm going to be really outgoing and have the nerve to invite everyone to be interviewed. And I always chicken out. But this time, I didn't chicken out. I actually persevered. And I got up the courage to ask Simon for an interview. He was cool enough to agree. We sat down and chatted all about Selenium, where he sees Selenium from its conception all the way to the future. Really great stuff. Really great guy. Really excited that I actually went through on it and ignored my feelings and got him to talk to me. So awesome interview. So this is one of those, I don't think I've only done one other episode where I interviewed someone face to face. It's usually always hiding in my office using Skype to interview people. So that's another thing that was different about this interview. So let's just jump right into it. Check it out. Test Talks is sponsored by the fantastic folks at Sauce Labs, the cloud-based automated testing platform that eliminates the need to maintain your own Selenium grid and test infrastructure. Try it for free today. Visit testtalks.com and click on the Sign Up Now link under the homepage sponsor section. Hey, Simon. Welcome to Test Talks.
Hi there. Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to finally have you on the show today. I think most people know you as the main author of Selenium WebDriver.
Yes.
So I'm just curious to know, it seemed to happen at ThoughtWorks, and it seems based on you gave a keynote today at SauceCon, and you talked about ThoughtWorks, all the people that were working there in ThoughtWorks. And why do you think so many test automation innovations came out of ThoughtWorks?
It's a good question. I think one of the interesting things was at the time when ThoughtWorks were doing this, there just wasn't that much tooling around. And then the other thing was that we were being told to be like good agile developers, good XPers, like extreme programming, and then you do TDD. And the problem is there isn't a framework to do the testing. So, what are you going to do? You're going to write the framework that allows you to do the testing. And the other thing as well is there were a group of people who were very talented, and ThoughtWorks allowed them the space to open source the things they were working on. So, for example, Joe Walnes was working on things like Xstream, ObGenesis, a whole bunch of other bits and pieces. Paul Hammond had his fingers in a lot of pies, but Pico Container and the rise of dependency injection and those frameworks. So that was sort of some of the big stuff that was going on. And then you had people like Mike Roberts and I guess Jess Humble as well, looking at continuous integration and CI servers and stuff like that. So like cruise control came out of ThoughtWorks, cruisecontrol.net came out of them as well. And what they were doing is just simply putting in place the infrastructure they needed in order to be able to follow through on the promise of sort of large-scale extreme programming.
And it was a consulting company, correct?
Yeah.
Why would they open source? I've always wondered why would they open source and not make some sort of financial play out of some of these tools? Well,
I mean, they did set up ThoughtWorks Studios in the end, which was good. But Roy Singham, who was the founder and CEO of ThoughtWorks, has a very sort of strong social conscience. And a lot of the work that ThoughtWorks does is around sort of diversity and improving access to, IT and tech and things like that. And so in that particular sense, a focus on open source is a really strong thing. But the other thing as well is, and like the pragmatic reason why WebDriver ended up being open source is if you go to a client site and you go, you need to pay a license fee in order to use this. Many clients who are already paying through the nose for consultants will go like, whoa, that's too much. Right. Whereas if you go, here's an open source library, they probably need to go through some sort of evaluation period to go, is this an appropriate tool to use? But if it's under like Apache 2 or the BSD license, then it's normally pretty easy to bring it in. So you lower the barrier of entry of being able to access consistent high quality tooling.
So during your keynote, I was kind of reminded how long you've actually been working on WebDriver. And you mentioned you thought it would only take 6 months. So I'm just curious, I know Jim Evans also has been working on it for a long time.
Yeah.
I guess my concern always is, like, not if you guys get hit by a bus, that's kind of a negative. So you guys just decide one day, I'm through with Selenium. Are there people that are to help with the project carry forward, or is this something that you have to, you guys always going to be involved with?
I'll be honest, it is a concern.
Yeah.
Like, it is something that I worry about. Like on the technical side, we've got a handful of people coming up. Like Alexei Barantsev is probably the sort of key newest member of the team, who's catching up rapidly with the number of commits. On the social side, the sort of steering committee with the SFC, the Software Freedom Conservancy, are also quite important. But I do worry about it because there isn't like a firebrand going, here's the direction we should take the project and run it. Before I took over and it was Jason was the one setting direction and going like, here we go, this is where we're going to go. And he did it collaboratively and excellently, but he was the one that was helping do that. When I took over, that was the thing that I would do. Like the number of conversations we'd have where it's like, how do we do this? And it's like, here's a vision. Here's why we do things the way we do. And I don't see that person. But then I think also we're now in a different part of the product lifecycle. So we've got the W3C standard coming through. And like I was having a conversation today with someone who goes like, oh, I'd like it if WebDriver did this, if Selenium did this. And it's like, well, the way you get that in is you put a pull request through for the W3C spec. That gets accepted. You write the tests to the web testing platform, web platform tests even. And then once that happens, the browser vendors go and they implement things, and then it happens and it becomes available. And that is a far more bureaucratic thing than we've ever had before. But the nice thing is it's now not dependent on an individual. It becomes a sort of piece of community infrastructure where anyone is more able to contribute in a way.
So that's interesting. That was going to be my next question. Was that one of the reasons why you pushed for W3C? So I think you mentioned a few times in previous sessions where you wouldn't have to do anything. You probably still would, but actually the browsers then would be responsible for their implementations of the drivers. And then at that point, would you be able to free yourself from it, or would you still have to be involved?
So there's a couple of interesting things. The first one is browsers, modern web browsers, are fearsomely complicated beasts. And some of them aren't open source. So we could probably go in and we could make modifications to Mozilla, to Firefox, and that would be okay. And we could probably, if we were really lucky, get changes into Chrome and WebKit. Like WebKit would be harder. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it's just way harder than it used to be. And realistically, the kind of changes we want with the level of privilege that we have requires fairly deep integration with the browser. And really, the only people who are in a position to do that are the browser vendors, as browsers go from relatively simple creatures. Yeah. And they were fearsomely complicated before, but relatively simple to now the things they are, which are sort of multi-threaded, apart, like Electron. Right. Happened with Firefox Quantum, which is a huge step forward where they started having separate processes. So, what the heck are we going to do here? So, I mean, they're the best place to do it. Yeah, so, I mean, that was the motivation. Like, how can we do it? For the projects, like, the W3C is very strongly led by browser implementers, like people involved in writing the browser. And sort of some of the conversations we have in the face-to-face sessions is, yes, I realize that the APIs we're suggesting are going to be harder to implement, and it would be simpler if there were primitives that were at a lower level. But from a user-facing point of view, like consumers of these APIs, it would be better if we did things this way. And so there's a sort of tension between sort of necessary complexity and a minimal amount of weight put on the browser vendors because they have to implement these specs. Right. compared to like complexity and weight put on the language implementations. Yep. And you can see that in a whole bunch of stuff. Like the Actions API that we came up with is super nice.
Yep.
But there isn't a primitive in it for like rotate, and at the moment there's no primitive for scrolling an element into view in the middle of an action chain, which is something of a problem because you go like, oh, I'm performing a sequence of actions, and by the way, something's off the screen, and normally it would just scroll into view and I could just wait and it would all be good.
Yep.
And now you have to break the actions, perform the scroll, come back to the actions. But then you've introduced like race conditions and lagginess and things like that, and it would be far better to push that stuff.
I don't know. I think Jim Evans, he's sitting here, so it's just triggering memories. I talked to him on Twitter about this. This is going to be a standard, but what do you think of companies that come out with solutions that aren't leveraging Selenium under the covers? Like they reinvent what seems to already be there rather than add, since it is open source and this is going to be a standard, why would they deviate from that? Does that bother you? Do you think that's an issue?
No, it doesn't bother me. Like I do open source because I'm not trying to take it. We have accidentally taken over the world, but I wasn't like the intent.
Right.
You know, it's there scratching an itch and having fun and solving a problem. I think if people want to burn limited engineering hours doing something that is a bit unusual, then that's fine. There are use cases where WebDriver isn't a great fit. There's a bunch of stuff being built on top of the Chrome debugging protocol, which you see like Cypress IO and Puppeteer and stuff like that are out there. And they give you access to capabilities that we don't currently surface through WebDriver. But what I think I would like to see is, rather than them trying to replicate all of the WebDriver functionality and more, and be like, well, why don't you I hate to use the word, leverage WebDriver that is baked into the browser and that will do a lot of hard work, and then you can just do the additional stuff as a layer on top. And that means that you get to focus on the things that make, using the Chrome debugging protocol a far better choice, like getting, accurate timing information or setting breakpoints or seeing when errors are thrown in the JavaScript or stuff like that. And then let the WebDriver spec be responsible for controlling the browser and doing things like keyboard and mouse emulation. Like that stuff is super hard to get right.
So with the Chrome debugging protocol now, is that outside the realm of Selenium? Or is that something you would see that Selenium would try to leverage at some point? Or
if you take a look at the Chrome driver, what happens is the executable that you run on your machine, called Chrome driver, sets up an HTTP server. And then that accepts the connections. It's responsible for managing the lifecycle of the Chrome browser. But what it does is it converts WebDriver calls into Chrome debugging calls. In the same way like the Opera driver used to convert to the scope protocol, the IE driver uses COM and stuff like that. So we have this sort of common layer of HTTP for communication. So, there's no reason why things can't play nicely together. Does that answer the question?
It does answer the question, yeah. It's one of those things you can't really predict yet, I think.
I will say, I think one of the things we're going to see that will happen, is I think the debugging protocols will end up being standardized as well. Like, you can see so much tooling built around it and finding it useful, that it would be really nice to be able to share this stuff. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if Mozilla, Chrome, Edge, Safari at some point all adopt a shared debugging protocol, which is standardized through maybe W3C, maybe WhatG.
So when you started working on WebDriver, what do you think was what it was going to be like before you worked on it, and what's it really like now compared to what your first thoughts were of what this was going to be?
So it started off as an implementation of the facade design pattern. So there were other tools out there, and they were perfectly fine. But their APIs were clunky. Like a chap called Michael Collis and myself in Australia were having a chat about HTTP unit, and it had this sort of flat API that conflated navigating, finding elements, and making assertions. And my argument to Michael was, oh, this is fine. I mean, it doesn't need to be that sophisticated. And Michael's argument was that this was a gross violation of the rules of object orientation, and we should do something different. And it turns out I was wrong and Michael was right. Like the OO approach makes the sort of testing infrastructure that you build and the tooling a lot easier to do. So, I mean, when I started it, what did I think would happen? It's like, oh, I'll just like write a nice facade. I'll do a couple of implementations and then it'll be done. And the IE thing, a friend at ThoughtWorks helped me get started because I know nothing, right? And then, so I was like delving into COM using C#. And then when we realized that in order to do that, we need to ship the COM into the COM C# interop libraries that you can build. But at the time you couldn't redistribute those. So you'd have to build them on the client machine, but you can't distribute the tooling you need to do that. And so, all right, we'll go to C++. Right. That'll be easier. And it just became a sort of massive yak shaving exercise. And each time it was like, well, I'll just get it to a point where I can do this. And then people went, Firefox. And it's like, I'll go read the source code of Firefox. Because, I don't know, I had too much time on my hands or something. I don't know. And Firefox is built on this technology called XPCOM, cross-platform COM, which was designed to interoperate with Microsoft COM to the point where IUnknown in both systems has the same GUID. So the idea would be, okay, you could start casting from one to the other and it would be kind of cool. And I don't think Mozilla ever followed through with that sort of promise of easy interoperability with the Windows ecosystem. But it's kind of interesting. And one of the things they did for the Windows ecosystem in Microsoft did is they had distributed COM or DCOM or COM Plus, I think was the other name for it. And so Mozilla were going to do distributed COM Plus. And buried in the guts of Firefox was a server socket, which was going to be the sort of building block that you would use for building distributed XPCOM. Oh, okay, I'll have a play with that. And did like the proof of concept of, hey, I could just telnet into Firefox and I can make it do things, which is like a weirdly liberating thing. And then I was incapable of stopping. Like I should have just stopped at that point, right? I got like, okay, I've proved the point. Right. I got a bit carried away. Yeah. And then like the thing was Selenium at the time was, slow. It was unstable. It had loads of bugs. And it was pretty clear that the JavaScript sandbox was going to become a limiting factor at some point. So it's like, well, how do you break out of this? And so it's like, well, I'll get WebDriver up to a point where I could replace Selenium in like maybe IE or just Firefox or something. And then by the time I got to that point, I'd already joined Google and we were sort of trying to figure out like what we were going to do for web testing at Google. And then it's like, we'll just consolidate onto this. And then we built out the team and the infrastructure for doing sort of millions of parallel tests on Google's amazing infrastructure, which I miss to this day. And so it was like, okay. And every single time it's like, I'll stop at the next milestone. Right. And the next milestone is clearly the W3C spec. Yep. And I think the interesting thing with the W3C spec is that's the point where the project ceases to be around one sort of body of open source developers and becomes like an industry thing. Right. And so it becomes incredibly hard for a single individual to exert any form of control over it. So I think that's going to be like the obvious natural stopping point.
Where do we stand with W3C? I think last time I looked into it, I think it was in beta or draft or like, is it now officially approved and blessed and browsers are, yes, we are implementing this going forward?
It is literally the most frustrating thing about the whole project at the moment. And I mean literally in the actual sense of literally, not the sense of figuratively. So the process of going from a working draft to a recommendation rec is you go through a number of things and you move through. We're currently at candidate recommendation. And then you move from candidate recommendation, CR, you move to PR, proposed recommendation. And that's the period where you go, actually, we think this is stable. Everyone look at it. Everyone vote on it. Figure out what you want to do. And at the end of the proposed recommendation period, you either move to recommendation or not. Now, the charter for our working group runs out in... Jim, can you remember how long our charter is? I don't. Sorry. The charter for our working group runs out in, I think, about a month, or like 2 months. And it takes about that amount of time to move from proposed recommendation to recommendation. So we really ought to transition from candidate recommendation to proposed recommendation. Now, in order to do that, what we need to be able to do is demonstrate interoperability. And in order to do that, what we need is we have a suite of tests, and we need 2 separate implementations to pass each of those tests. And it doesn't need to be the same one every time. You just need to read across a line and see like 2 green boxes against each test.
All right.
And that's proving challenging. Like, the number of people on the Selenium project who work on work on Selenium is minimal, but the number of people working on automation APIs is also minimal for the browser vendors. There's 1 person, maybe 2 people at Apple. John Johnson has a team working on Edge, and they're making great progress. David Burns at Mozilla working on WebDriver. That's 3 or 4 people. It's a small group of people, and we've got like Jim working on the IE driver. So the small number of people and the complexity of what you're trying to implement is pretty tiny. I think Google have 1 or 2 people as well.
Right.
So it's just a case of like getting through the release cycles and getting software out there. I'm pretty optimistic that we'll be able to do it. Like, one of the things we can do is say to the W3C, look, we have got something passing for every single test, and that is true. And we have 2 implementations for almost everything at the moment. And what we can do is explain to the W3C, like, this is why this isn't happening. So, for example, some tests around clear rely on HTML5 input elements, and those aren't implemented in IE. So no matter what Jim does, we're never going to get that test to pass. But he is performing according to specification.
Right.
And so you can do sort of text-based description of what's going wrong. And that's what we're preparing at the moment.
What happens if you did lose your charter? Where does it go? Does that ever happen? That you have to start from scratch?
I don't think we'd start from scratch. No. I don't know what would happen. Right. And I don't want to think about it.
Right, okay.
I suspect we'd probably end up moving to the WhatG, just because there's enough people invested in this process to figure it out. But that isn't the voice of the working group. That's just like my personal opinion of what would probably happen. Like, I think the spec would continue because there's so many people who see so much value in having it.
Cool. So, Simon, you've worked for Google, you worked for Facebook, you worked for ThoughtWorks.
Yeah.
What are you doing now?
What am I doing now? I am a principal engineer at a company called Deliveroo. Who are sort of doing food delivery from restaurants. That's kind of fun because they're going from being a sort of small organization to having a larger engineering org, and they're running into all the growing pains. And it's really fun to be there as an organization figures out, like, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to do it, and grows through that.
How hands-on are you now? Are you still in the guts, the code, or are you more like high level, here's the direction?
Of Selenium.
Of your new job?
Oh, in the new job. I've only been there a month.
Oh, okay.
But in that time, there's a bunch of people at Deliveroo who worked at The Guardian who have a really strong technical team. There's people from Facebook, so obviously there's that. And there's some people from Twitter as well. Like, it's a really good, strong technical team. Yep. And it is the politest group of people. Like, I kicked off a discussion about like what programming languages we should use for the back-end services. Yep. And normally this would be like the most ridiculous thing to do. You'd imagine it being a massive flame war and like people doing like ad hominem attacks and being rude to each other, and like, cause it's a thing that people feel really passionate about. And, like at Deliveroo, everyone was like very patient, listened to each other, had a conversation based on data, and were respectful. And like a couple of times where it was like, I don't like the way you phrased that, I'd go and talk to the person and they would help me reword it. And it was a really enjoyable, collaborative thing. And I think we've reached agreement on what we should be doing with like just no name calling, just an incredibly civilized thing. And it's the most mature conversation I've ever seen in a technical organization. So I'm feeling pretty hopeful about that. Like, I think it's a good team. They're solving interesting problems and we're growing and we're figuring out how to do that in a way that sort of keeps that nice, respectful culture. with the Selenium project, I'm still hands-on with that.
Yeah.
I'm not full-time. I do 3 days a week at Deliveroo, and 2 days a week I spend on my own stuff. And my own stuff is very clearly Selenium. So,
right. So when you're helping push the architecture of a new product or a new team, I don't know if you've said this or Jim said it. He said, someone asked him once before, I have like 30,000 Selenium tests and, what should I do? And he said, the first thing you should do is stop running Selenium tests.
Oh yeah, no.
So what's your approach with the architecture? Do you actually try to drive more things at the API level, or is that something you even get into?
Like whenever I have this conversation, I always point people at Michael Feather's book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code.
Yeah.
Well, the definition of legacy code is code without tests.
Right.
And with that, the idea is like, you just throw like an end-to-end test over things. And as you change things, you write like the smallest possible test you can.
Right.
And hopefully you fix things. But I think there's some really interesting stuff happening in the world of testing. And I think it's a sort of, the systems we build are now increasingly distributed. So like, how do you do testing of a distributed system? Like, we all have test environments that don't really represent reality, right? How do we guarantee that things we've done work? I think we're moving to a world where we're going to end up canarying more things in production so you write unit tests, you write integration tests, and you go like, oh, okay, I think life is good. I'm going to canary now to, just people coming from this subnet, and that's just your tests. And then charity majors and Honeycomb.io and stuff like that are sort of leading the charge with observability and structured logging and digging into stuff like New Relic, Datadog, companies like that also provide that kind of insight. And so I think what you're going to see is less of a reliance on traditional forms of testing and sort of more focus on observability and being able to interrogate this system as it runs in a production-like environment. And I think at the same time, you're still going to find people writing unit tests. Like a mature, sensible developer would not push to production with no idea whether or not it works. That would be madness. Yep. So you're still going to end up doing unit tests and integration tests. Like if you take a look at an AWS Lambda, for example, you can only do unit testing, and then you have to deploy it somewhere in order to find out like how it interacts with the rest of the system.
Right. So we were in a meeting yesterday, and AI came up.
Yeah.
And so, what are your views on AI in automation?
It's oversold. Like the term artificial intelligence became so polluted that people working in that field had to rename it machine learning. And then, you've got like deep machine learning. Right. And deep doesn't mean anything particularly clever. It just means your neural networks are like a certain depth, right? A certain size, which you can now do with GPUs and stuff like that. If you treat AI as the application of statistics to a problem, then I think you end up with something far more interesting. So we generate a wealth of data from our continuous integration services, from our test runs, from production, from our source control systems. And we're not very good at piecing that data together into information. So like the question that I would love to be able to answer is, I've made a change in this piece of code. What is the minimal number of tests that I should be able to run in order to figure out whether or not this change is good or bad? Because you don't want to run everything. Like the analogy I gave yesterday, I think was like Nero in Star Trek, like fire everything, because you don't know whether or not it works.
Right.
Like we should have some precision at this point. We shouldn't really be doing like blunt force trauma to our code bases. So with precision, we should be able to tell what the minimal subset of tests is. And then we should be able to figure out like, okay, normally when we run these tests are good and these ones are more likely to fail. So we'll front load these ones. Because what we're attempting to do isn't run all the tests. We're not in the business of running tests. We want to be able to estimate risk of release. And we want the feedback to be as quick as possible. So what you want to do is you want to front load the risky pieces. And if they look good, then life is going to be, significantly more likely to be good. Like you can never release with confidence that everything is going to work. Bugs happen in production all the time. But our test suites and the reason why we do all this stuff and code coverage and static analysis and log analysis and stuff like that is to give us confidence that the risk is minimal. and the more data we have and the more information we derive from that data, the better we can make a sort of reasoned discussion about risk and push into production.
Simon, I'd like to keep these about a half hour. So I have one last question.
Okay.
But is there any question you wanted me to ask, or is there any question that you've never been asked about Selenium that you just want to riff on? Or
I've never been asked about Selenium.
But you thought, how come no one's ever asked me about this?
I mean, I'll be honest, most people have asked, like, it's been going for now, I've been involved since 2007, like that's 11 years.
Yeah.
The project has been running for since 2004, so that's 14 years. Like most of the questions that people are going to ask is that. I think one of the things that you mentioned before was like, oh, don't run the tests. Like, I'm not seeing, you talk to organizations and they either do no Selenium testing or like way too much.
Yeah.
And I think the sort of interesting question is like, how do you find a sweet spot for doing end-to-end testing? And how do you minimize the number of false positives and false negatives that you get coming from that process? And that is very much a sort of engineering-led conversation where you take a look at sort of root cause analysis and stuff like that. Like sometimes you look at people working and they go, oh, this test is flaky. It's like, you want to go Yoda on them, like pass or do not pass. There is no flake. You want to be able to do this. And the thing that I see lacking is people doing root cause analysis. So I think one of the things that might be interesting is like, how do you use Selenium to help you drive toward starting the process of root cause analysis? Like the only thing a Selenium test can tell you is something in the system somewhere isn't working. Right. But, you've poked it in hopefully a repeatable way. Hopefully a test fails consistently. Like, how would you use that as the very first step in a debugging process? Cool. And what would it look like? There must be a generalized approach possible somehow.
All right, Simon, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you can give someone to improve their Selenium testing efforts? And let us know the best way to find or contact you.
I'm on Twitter at SHS96C, which is my old university login. Actionable advice. Yeah. So first bit is if you have an XPath that is literally a path through your document, HTML, body, you're doing it wrong. Stop, think, there's a better way of doing this. Second piece of advice, WebDriver.findElement will return an element and you can keep hold of that reference. Like quite often I look at people's tests and they go like driver.findElement, clear, driver.find the same element, send keys, driver.findElement, the same element, submit. And you're going like, each WebDriver call is an RPC. Mm-hmm. And if you're using a system like Source, for example, you've just gone out over the internet. And the problem is you can just keep hold of the element reference and you're good. So really that should be WebDriver.findElement, keep hold of that reference. Element.clear, element.sendkeys, element.submit. Yeah. And you've reduced the amount of work you're doing. You'll have sped up the tests. And if you find that you're finding stale element exceptions being thrown, that means the application has been changing the state in a way that you weren't expecting. And as a tester, that should just set off all sorts of alarm bells. Or as a developer, that should be setting off alarm bells going like, how come I don't know the state of the application? And so that stale element exception is not a problem. It's an opportunity to go and find out more about what is going on in the application.
Awesome.
Those are the actionable pieces of advice.
Cool. Right. Thank you, Simon, so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I can't believe I've never had you on the show before, but this has been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon, for your Selenium automation awesomeness. For links to everything of value we covered in this episode, head on over to testtalks.com/210. And while you're there, make sure to click on the sign up for free trial link under the exclusive sponsor section to learn all about Sauce Labs' awesome products and services. So that's it for this episode of Test Talks. I'm Joe, and my mission is to help you succeed with creating automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Test Talks podcast. Head on over to www.testtalks.com for full show notes, amazing blog articles, and other automation awesomeness.